So, hello and welcome everyone to whoever is listening to this particular podcast on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or Google or any other platforms. I am Shah. I'm a PhD student at Arizona State University, and I invite people who are working directly or indirectly with the domains of artificial intelligence to share their insights and talk to them through this podcast. And for this particular podcast, I have with me Cade Metz, who is a reporter at the New York Times, where he frequently covers emerging areas of artificial intelligence, from self driving cars to virtual reality and much more. Prior to that, he was also a senior staff writer at The Wired magazine, covering stories about big tech companies and their role in the rise of AI, bitcoins, and much more. He has a strong background in reporting and is also coming out with his own book called The Genius Makers on March 16th, which we'll be talking about more on that in this particular podcast. So, Cade, welcome to this podcast and thanks for being here.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right, so before we get started into the details of what you do can you tell us a bit about your background and how did you end up covering stories about AI, and why do you think AI, why do we need AI in this current age?
Well, I grew up with an interest in technology in large part because of my father. My father was a career IBMer. He was an engineer, electrical engineer by training, a programmer at IBM. He actually worked on the Universal Product Code, which is the barcode that's on all our groceries. That was developed at IBM in the early 70s. And he helped test that platform. And growing up, that project in particular was the source of some amazing stories about how it was developed, how it was conceived by this guy named Joe Woodland in the 50s. He actually, drew, it looked different at the time, but essentially he drew his vision for the barcode in the sand when he was on vacation in the 50s. And then by the 70s, the technology was there to make that happen. And my father used to tell great stories about that project, but also about his work at IBM in general, and about his love for programming in particular. One of his heroes was a guy named Alan Kay, who was at the Xerox PARC Research Lab in the 70s. Yeah. And he developed a language called Smalltalk, and Smalltalk was like the ultimate language to my father. And he used to love to talk about Alan Kay and that language. All of which is, all of this is a way of saying that my father's background really influenced who I was in general. And another part of who I was I was always a writer and always wanted to be a writer. And that in large part came from my mother, who very much had the sensibility of an English major. And, she had, a shelf full of first editions in our living room. And I learned to be a reader and a writer from her. And that's what I studied when I went to university. I was an English major at Duke University on the East Coast in North Carolina, where I'm from. That's where my dad worked for IBM. But at the same time, I took computer science courses at Duke, and I actually interned at IBM myself as a programmer in the summers, writing programs to test network cards. So I had this dual background, and that led to my career covering tech. I was with a publication you may or may not know called The Register, which at the time, it's a British publication. At the time, it was one of the world's largest science and technology news sites. And I ran the US coverage for The Register at our bureau in San Francisco. And then I moved to Wired magazine, which you mentioned, and was a staff writer there for 5 or 6 years before moving to the Times. And it was at Wired when, the AI field really started to take off in its current form, meaning, the idea of a neural network really started to work for speech recognition, for image recognition. And our aim at Wired was to figure out where the big technical changes were happening that were really going to impact the world and really cover that. And this became the key area. right? As we started to see the results in speech recognition and then image recognition, with the AlexNet result 2012 from Jeff Hinton and two of his students. That's when we really started to cover this area hard, and it was a good bet on because that has just continued um, to drive a lot of the change in this area. Right? It's not just image and speech recognition; it's natural language understanding now in a big way. This, of course, plays into driverless cars, all sorts of other robotics. And then it led to my book, which is really about the people who believed in that idea, the idea of a neural network. Some dating all the way back to the 50s, right? And some of them, like Jeff Hinton, who's now at Google, um, really hung on to that idea and continued to work on it for decades, even when no one thought it would ever work. And so that was kind of the kernel for the book. And so the book kind of really dovetails with my beat at the Times.
Right, right. Yeah, this is really interesting, and the one thing that really intrigues for me is to ask a question that always has different answer to whatever whoever I have interviewed this podcast is. What does AI mean to you? And the reason I'm excited for this answer is because when I ask these people who are working within some machine learning role, researcher, professor, they give the definitions in much more of a technical jargon, which varies from person to person or the specific area of research that they are doing. But I would love to learn more about what does AI mean to you based on how you have been covering. Like you said, you know pretty much about all the breakthroughs that has been happening through a long amount of time at a much more mature age. Then what does AI mean to you accordingly, and how exactly people are adapting to AI right now in the last few years, like you mentioned, maybe after 2012?
Yeah, so this is also something I'm trying to do with the book, and I really feel strongly about this, that the term artificial intelligence, it means almost nothing, right? I mean, you're right. This term gets applied to almost every technology that comes out nowadays. Everything is AI, um, and um, and what that does is it just confuses people, right? If you're reading tech,
Or scares,
mainstream, yeah,
or maybe scares them.
it scares them, it confuses them. They don't know the difference between, say a model that can recognize an image and this, dream of so-called AGI, right? Something that can do anything the human brain can do, and that's all gets muddled together. And certainly, if you read the mainstream press, it's hard to understand what that term means. And so, one of the things the book does is it shows kind of um, the way that same thing has happened over the decades, right? In the 50s, when the term artificial intelligence was coined, the people who coined the term at this conference at Dartmouth in the late 50s, they were convinced that they were building like something in the image of the brain and that it would duplicate what the brain can do in relatively short order, right? And that did not happen, right? And you could see this in the pages of the New York Times, where a guy named Frank Rosenblatt, who worked on an early version of the neural network called the perceptron, was covered in the pages of the New York Times, and he talked about it. The perceptron is something that would not only recognize images and recognize spoken words, but generate its own language and like create and repair itself on the assembly line, and then it was going to fly into space and it was going to do who knows what there. And that's in the pages of the New York Times. The average person is reading that, and I feel like a version of that goes on today and has gone on for years. I don't know how the average person can really understand what's going on after reading all the coverage that has sort of rolled out over the past few years. And what I want to do in part with the book is, like the main thing is about these people who believe in this idea. We can get to that, but then also I just want to show what is the reality of what has happened, right? That and that AI means different things to different people. And if you go to someone at OpenAI, the lab in San Francisco, it's going to mean something very different than if you go to someone who's building a speech classifier, at a university somewhere else, right? Um, what is AI is different to even the people in the field. I don't think people realize that like AI, the group of AI researchers on Earth is not this big monolithic thing that agree. It's not like everyone agrees on what AI is and where it will go. It's a spectrum of beliefs and a spectrum of perspectives.
Yeah, I actually wanna circle back to that particular topic later on, which is like how different perspectives are there between these big tech giants who are trying to pull the definitions and maybe recreate every now and then what AI means and what it should be. But I want to circle that at the later part of this particular podcast. But you also mentioned one thing, that you have been covering these things since a very long time. So prior to that, I saw that you were you were at the PC magazine for a very long amount of time, and you were working with somewhat, I would say, computer technology based, not necessarily AI, but definitely you were at the intersection that deals with computer technologies. So do you see, in layman terms, like, do you see how, if you see, then how much do you see in terms of the advancements that are happening right now in terms of technology? And do you see a change in dynamic? Is it like very robust right now, like every now and then you wake up and you see something really breakthrough happening? Or was it something, the same thing prior to few, like before 2010 too? Or like what kind of dynamics that you have seen being changed in terms of technological innovations in the last few years?
Yeah, the way I think about this, and this is also something that the book seeks to do, is that the real change that has occurred um, over the past 10 years is that neural networks have started to work, right? That is not to say that there aren't other ways of building so-called AI. There are certainly, other methods that are useful in so many different areas. But what has really happened, I think, is the best way for the layperson to think about it, is that this old idea of a neural network, a system that can learn a task on its own, learn a skill on its own, has started to work. And it's started to work with image recognition, speech recognition. Now we're seeing it really work in a lot of ways with natural language understanding. Like I said, that plays into driverless cars and robotics. That is where the big change has been, right? And the reason that is important is because really for the first time, we have systems that learn by analyzing, a very, very large amount of data. And that's powerful because, you know, a lot of the development of the system, right, of the product, um, is allowed to happen through this training phase, right, this learning phase, as opposed to getting a bunch of engineers in a room and have them piece by piece build the system, and piece by piece build an image recognition system and define what the system needs to do. We're moving to this point, where the system is really learning the skill, right? And I think that something like these giant language models like GPT-3 are a really good example. It would take a lot of engineers a lot of time to build a system that can do that by hand. Now we have this method where you have a model that literally learns its skill over the course of months, right? Analyzing thousands of books, Wikipedia articles, other data from the internet, right? That's a real change in the way that technology is built, and it's happening on a greater and greater scale, and that's incredibly powerful in a lot of ways. But there are also drawbacks, right? In that we don't, because we as humans can't wrap our brain around all that data that the machine has learned from. We can't know all the skills it has learned. We can't know all the outcomes of this system. How it might behave in certain situations, because it can it can wrap its head around all that data, so to speak. I'm using a metaphor there, but we can't, right? it can grasp the entirety of that data, and we as humans just can't understand. It's talked about a lot, but it is a black box,
Black box. Yeah.
but we can't really have full insight into that. It's a powerful idea, but it also comes with concerns.
And do you think the recent terms like explainability and interpretability focuses that has been revolving around those terms? Do you think they have any maturity? As in, do you see any valid application that people can say that, hey, yes, we can actually take a step towards saying that we have made deep learning models explainable? Do you
I'm
think?
not I'm not convinced by that, right? I know that there are a lot of people working on that, and there's been a lot of interesting work there, but at the same time, the models are getting bigger and bigger, and they're getting harder to understand and explain, so to speak. And some people see it very differently. That there may not be hope when it comes to explainability, but ultimately, what it's about is just testing your system, right?
Yeah.
So you train it, and then um, uh, you got to rigorously test the system and make sure it works in so many different situations. Now that is in itself a gargantuan task,
Yeah.
but it might be easier than explaining, right? Um, Ultimately, how do you explain everything that GPT has learned? That that's extremely difficult.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. That's true. I definitely agree to that. But I'm a little bit optimistic because I have seen few methods where we are trying to make at least the statistical models that we had based on the standard machine learning techniques. And there have been some very good methods that can actually explain you all the tabular data, for example. I mean, we are not definitely near to solving deep learning models, but I am really optimistic that maybe some method would definitely take a shot at explaining deep learning method. But yeah, definitely, it's good to know that yeah, a lot of mature work has to be yet to be done. And before I get to the topics of like a few AI topics that are the hotshot topics right now, I just have one question, and this question definitely comes from a student perspective, and a lot of people watching this are students. Is how do you, as a reporter, how what is the life cycle of an article that you write look like? For example, picking a topic, how do you first of all classify that is something that you want to write about, and what are the next steps of ABCs of writing a good article? Definitely, I mean, you're working at New York Times, which has some of the best uh, resources of standardizing. Like, a lot of people consider NYT to be the best source of information. So how do you go on to selecting the topic and then later on finding the information that is most up to date? I mean, that shouldn't be a Reddit channel for sure. Like, nobody should be posting garbage. So what does the life cycle according for your articles look like?
Well, the life cycle, it can vary from story to story, but what I will say is that the life cycle is longer than people think, and far more, at least with my stories and the stories of a lot of my colleagues at the Times. Um, so much reporting goes into stories, and what it's really about is talking to people, people like yourself, and others in the field, and getting opinions and asking people what they're working on. And then, once you have that information, then you go to the next person, and you maybe even you ask that first person, who else should I talk to? Like, who would you recommend, right? And you sort of get this chain of people that you talk to. And what ends up happening is the same topic comes up time and again, right? And when that starts to happen, you tend to think, aha, there might be a story here, right?
Right.
Many people who I trust, who know what they're talking about, are pointing toward this particular thing. And I think a good example of the way this can work is the language model situation we've been talking about. So, what what I saw first, um, was that Fast AI built one of these big language models, and it was interesting. And I talked to a guy named Jeremy Howard about that, who was involved in that. And then AI, the Allen AI Institute, um, did something similar, right? It built on that work. That was increasingly interesting. OpenAI comes out with it's transformer based, the original version of GPT. And again, so you're seeing this progress. And then Google BERT comes out, right? And that's when the story came together. Like Allen AI, in developing their model, they had put out a paper, and they had a benchmark for it, right? They said, we're seeing progress here, but what we really need to do is solve these types of questions, and our model can't do that. Google BERT comes along and it solved that, right, so to speak. I mean, it
Right.
really cracked this benchmark that Allen AI had laid down. And that's when that at that moment I thought, okay, now we've got a story, right? We've seen this build, we see the continued progress. I talked to so many people, you could see that the progress would continue, and I think that's key. And it has, by the way. Now that's now what, 2 years ago, and through GPT-2, GPT-3, the work at Facebook and Google, which hasn't necessarily seen the light of day yet, but that they've published about, this area has become hugely important, and I felt like we hit it perfectly. Now, some people disagree with me, but when Google BERT came out, that was an inflection point, right? We had a great story. GPT-3 is another, interesting advance, and because of the sort of the generative stuff that it does, it's able to generate its own tweets and blog posts, and it's still flawed, but when that system sort of does these unexpected things, like even generate, small computer programs, um, it's it's worth covering, right? And it's worth kind of the Times audience knowing about this, the
Right.
general audience. And again, I felt like we hit that right. I had early access to GPT-3. I didn't write about it when it came out. I wrote about it after it was in the hands of a lot of developers, and I could see what they did, and I could talk to them about what they did and how they saw it. And the better time to do it was a few months after GPT-3 had been released, at least privately to a lot of developers, because you could get a much better sense of what it really meant.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. So you kind of have this pipeline of sources that you think are good enough, and if you see a lot of majority of green lights, people talking about a similar thing, that's when you select that this is something interesting to write about, and then you go on browsing the information available, what you can do. So that's,
That's
yeah,
right.
that's,
And but I'm also always looking for new people, um,
yeah.
who I have to talk to, who I need to talk to, and I think that's important. I'm constantly talking to people and then asking them, who else should I talk
Right.
to? I think that's key.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the topics that we pinned earlier, and I guess I was talking to this particular podcast before we started the hit record button, is an article that I really liked reading about and learning more about a topic that I have been reading from other sources. But your article kind of sums up really well. Was the Slate Star Codex? I wouldn't say issue, but I mean the whole topic, I would say. And it was a really nice article because it summarized all the information into one place, I'll leave a link to that particular article in the description of this video. But I want to hear the background thoughts while you were writing that article, because surely even my information might be biased. Is what I understand from that particular I would say tug of war was the idea of freedom of thoughts, like basically trying to have a freedom of platform where people can debate about topics that could be critical sometimes, talking about AI, technology, philosophy, psychology, and a lot of stuff, versus the idea of understanding that it could boil down to a certain topic, and what the article says, like off limits things. So you shouldn't be talking about something that can spark off something wrong. So I want to learn more about from your article. I know the article stands on a neutral ground over there. So I want to learn for people who might not have an idea about the Slate Star Codex whole thing. Can you give us a brief intro about what that thing according to you was before you started reporting that thing, and what is what like we most of the people should understand that there are merits to that particular ideology, but there are also challenges to that ideology. So can you talk to more about that back behind the scenes of that article?
Absolutely, and I think you've understood it well. You know, again, it was an article with a long gestation period, right? As again, to go back to my book, in my book, there's this moment where um, Eliezer Yudkowsky, who sort of helped spark the creation of this community called the Rationalists, which we'll get to. But he is befriended by Peter Thiel, a notable venture capitalist. And in my book, Yudkowsky introduces Thiel to two of the founders of what would become DeepMind, right? And it ends up being an important moment because DeepMind, in many ways, is at the forefront of a lot of the global AI research. And with that funding from Thiel, they go on to create this company. And not too long after that, it's basically 4 years after that, they're acquired by Google for $650 million, right? And it's part of this AI boom of the last 10 years. And and I talk about in the book, kind of in broad strokes, the community that Yudkowsky came from, but the deeper story is about this notion of the rationalists, right, and this community that he very much helped create. And more than a year ago, I started looking into a story about this community, which, as you can see from that moment in my book, is in many ways influential, right? And it's not just that moment. A lot of these ideas, um, uh, in a way, helped spawn the creation of DeepMind, but also OpenAI, which we've talked about, right? Which was sort of a response to DeepMind, and both those labs have hired from the rationalist community. And if you follow this space, like, the rationalists are an obvious part of it, right? This community, which was created about 15 years ago.
So,
Um,
so I mean, just to
yeah,
clarify for people who
yeah,
might not know, like, what do these rationalists exactly mean in terms of AI definitions?
exactly. So it's this online community which sprung up from a collection of blogs about 15 years ago, including one written by Yudkowsky himself. And it's often hard to explain, but ultimately it's pretty simple, right? Yudkowsky very much believed that AI could one day, and maybe not as far away as people thought, could one day destroy us all, right? And this was a real concern of his. And so you had this group that sprung up around him and carried that same belief. Um, uh, but part of the ideology is also to kind of not only rethink AI, right, but rethink you know almost everything that goes on in the world, right, with this kind of scientific and rational thought. The rationalists often apply statistics and probability to their lives and to the world. So not just with AI, they believe that there's a real possibility it could destroy the world, so you need to pay attention to that. But they apply this kind of statistical and probabilistic reasoning to all sorts of things, whether it's a global pandemic, healthcare, various other things. But as one person in my story described it, that they believed that they were more rational than everyone, so they kind of believed in their own internal notions, right? And so they have a lot of beliefs that might seem strange to people. Um, but it's a very real, organized, tight community. Um, there's an organization that has organized seminars around the rationalist way of thinking. There's another group that does summer camps for high school students, and like I said, this community kind of overlaps with Silicon Valley in a lot of ways, not just with AI labs, but you see that sort of overlap in various parts of the tech industry, and yet no one ever really writes about them, right? And a lot of that is because they are wary of the press, and if they think that the press is going to write a story that isn't exactly what they want written, they really put a lot of pressure, to be frank, on the reporters, either to go away or to not write the story. And that ended up happening with my story, right? I mean, as I was sort of building this story, I focused on Slate Star Codex, which is kind of the blog that was at the center of the community. And you know, and sadly, I was caught up, and the New York Times was caught up in the story itself, and there's a long saga, most of which is detailed in the story. But again, I think you're right that the story came to be about this notion, which many in that community believe in, that you know you should have the right to talk about controversial ideas, right? And in some cases, really controversial or even toxic ideas. I'm seeing, like in the comment section at Slate Star Codex and related forums at Reddit, there were known, well-known white supremacists and neo-eugenicists, right? And people who flirt with and even go further with race science. That was just part of the setup there. And the rationalist way of looking at that is, we need the right to talk about and think about all these things, even if it's particularly extreme. They look at it that way, and they would argue that the right to do that is well worth any consequence. There are other people who, in my story as well as outside my story, who are concerned about that, right? That can be an on-ramp to radical thought, and if you give airspace to really extreme ideas, there can be problems down the road. And certainly we've seen that kind of radicalization in recent years, and they've done studies on this. I quote a researcher based in Switzerland who did a study, showing that the community that calls itself the intellectual dark web, which sort of has a similar attitude when it comes to this notion of controversial ideas. When they would openly discuss some radical ideas, you could actually see how people could would jump from those ideas, to more extreme ideas, in the alt right. They would sort of track, YouTube views and show how that could happen. And that's ultimately what the story was about, right? It's about a mindset which is common not only in that community of the rationalists, but in Silicon Valley circles, very, very particular certain Silicon Valley circles, which I detail in the piece. And it's almost like that there's this third thing when you thought there were only two, meaning, we tend to think of in terms of Democrats and Republicans, one pitted against the other. But, in Silicon Valley, there's this third group, that thinks a little differently. And that's worth writing about, right? Because Silicon Valley has become so important. Yeah. AI has become so important, not just to the tech industry, but to all of us, right? It's in our daily lives. It's some of the most ambitious and important and powerful of projects, and it is certainly worth writing about. How the people building that technology are thinking and how they approach the world.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, that is what makes that particular article really interesting, is the basic instinct for us is to pick a side, right? Like whenever something comes up that is highly talked about, our as a human instinct is who's right, who's wrong, and it's really hard to pick a side in this particular case, because what they say is definitely makes sense. I mean, everybody should have a freedom to discuss in order to get the best ideas, but at the end, like you said, certain topics shouldn't be given so much air so that they can just have a wildfire. So that definitely intrigues, and that is what really that makes to me that particular topic very interesting. It's something that I guess I have to settle with to understand is both these sides. I should just know both these sides. I don't have to pick a side, but it's fair to know what both of these sides have to say. So yeah.
I think you're exactly right. And the other point I would make is that that's my job as a journalist, and it's a job I very much believed in. And I And I feel like increasingly people, and in some ways I understand this, but I think that people are misunderstanding what a journalist does, right? My job is to find those areas that are important to society at large, right? Whether that's the arrival or GPT-3 or the rationalist community, and this idea of a gray tribe that believes in absolute free speech. That's important. All those things are important to the average person, I believe, and that's why I wrote about them. And my job is to shine a light on them and not take a side, but to show people what's going on and give them a good sense of it, and give them the information they need to make their own opinions, right? And judge for it themselves and decide where they want to be in the world and where they think the world should go based on where it is now. That's really the way we think about it at the Times, and other publications behave differently, certainly, and journalism is changing, certainly, so to speak. But at the Times, it's very clear to us, but I also understand how it can be hard to wrap your head around the way journalism works if you haven't done it yourself.
Yeah, yeah, definitely second to that. Yeah. And one of the other things that might be slightly related to the matter, and you frequently do also write about these things, is the role of ethics in AI. And we see these concerns about ethics in AI and related. Mostly, these are the big tech companies who are taking all the heat. I'm not sure if that is a coincidence or if that is the only possibility that's why that's happening. But we see these big companies like Facebook, Google, Twitter, all these people try to get themselves, like, I mean, I won't say they try, but definitely they get caught up into the heats of people who have concerns related to ethics when AI tools come into place. In your understanding and in much more simpler terms, where do you see the problem really is? I mean, is that a coincidence that these things are happening multiplied by all the organizations that we have, or is it just the problem of what we understand ethics in general? Because when we see, like, we are trying to combine these two research topics like ethics and science, how AI works and how the science technologies develop into the human society. Where do you see the problem is? Do we have to change the definitions of ethics in general, or is the problem something much more than that?
Well, again, I think sometimes it's a problem of terminology. Like, and we discussed the term artificial intelligence and how there's so much misunderstanding around that, and how it gets applied to so many different things. Um, AI ethics is a broad term, right? And it gets applied to so many different things. I really think that if, as we discuss this and write about it and think about it, you really have to separate out what's going on, right? Um, you know, the weaponization of the technology, right? Using this type of technology to build automated weapons, I think, is one thing. Um, and and there are a lot of different ways to look at that. I think a lot of the controversy over that recently has been about people who are working at companies, right? That they don't necessarily think of as military companies, right? So you go to Google and you think you're going to work for a consumer company, and then suddenly that company is building AI for the Defense Department, and that's going to be surprising to you, right? And some people, are very much opposed to doing that kind of work personally, right? And that's really kind of what happened at Google. They were involved in this project for the DoD called Project Maven, where they were essentially helping to build models that could help recognize objects in drone footage. And many employees were really concerned about that. There was a protest at the company. Google ended up pulling out of the project, right? Meanwhile, I just wrote a story today about Anduril, which is a company in Southern California founded by Peter Thiel, among others, or backed by Peter Thiel, among others, founded by Palmer Luckey, the founder of the Oculus VR headset, which was sold to Facebook, and also founded by some of the ex-employees of Palantir, which is a government startup started by Peter Thiel and others. That company, Anduril, is designed to build technology for the DoD, right? Everyone there knows what they signed up for, and they are all in on that, right? They are willing to say we're going to put, we could potentially put weapons on these autonomous drones, right? And so they see it very differently, and there's not that tension that there was inside Google or that you saw inside Microsoft even and Amazon, where you had employees protesting uh, projects that involve the military, right? So that's one field, and that alone is so complicated. Then you go over to the AI bias question, and it's not, it's systems like GPT-3 that can generate toxic language, right? Hate speech, essentially. That's a real thing, right? We as humans exhibit bias when we talk, when we write, when we post things to the internet. GPT-3 is learning from the internet. It's going to learn from our biases, right? And so it becomes a question of how do we deal with that? And on one side, you've got companies who really want to get that technology out, right? Google, it's not just Google, it's Google. OpenAI is working hand in hand with Microsoft. You know, Facebook's working on similar technology. They want that technology because it can improve their services, from the Google search engine to chatbots on down the line. At the same time, it inherently shows bias, right? There's no getting around that. It just does. And it's a very hard problem to fix, again, because the data it trains on is so large, all right? And that's just fundamentally the way it works. And so what we're reaching here is a clash, right, between the companies that really want to get this out and people who are really concerned that a lot of these systems are biased against women and people of color, right? I don't know how this is going to be resolved. You know, just a few years ago, Microsoft released a chatbot called Tay, which was much simpler technology, and within minutes of that being released, you know, people were showing how it could hate speech, and Microsoft took it down. Right? That's been years. How are they going to deal with GPT-3 as that you know gets rolled into the new breed of chatbot? A better, more powerful chatbot, but also something that has this same problem. Right? You know, I think that we're reaching a moment where that clash is going to come to the fore. It already started to at Google.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree to that. And just to add a one point on that is, I guess, like you said, there is no way. I mean, the model is learning biases for sure. But I was talking to this professor to this particular previous to this particular podcast, and he said, I mean, bias is one of the terms that actually makes the model good at classification. So there is a certain set of bias that we actually have to do that in order to make the model classify accurately. But again, and at the end, what we need, what the machine learning experts or the people who are developing these algorithms should know is there are good biases and there are bad biases. So certain biases make the model good. And for example, I mean, he was a medical professional, and he was saying that there are certain data that we cannot see. I mean, we cannot see the patterns that, for example, the disease that is to be diagnosed, it has relevance to the gender, sex, or all those things. But there is these are some medical terms that has nothing to do with the ethical concerns, but they are legit symptoms or biomarkers. But to understand that relevance and the correlation between those classifications are making sense, there should be understanding that there are bad biases and there are good biases. So to add to your point is, I don't think that learning biases would be a bad thing, but I would say that there should be a tool development that can say that these are the biases that the model has learned. Please verify, are these biases valid enough to be deployed in the real world or not? So I guess it has to be a second layer of some development that has to be done on top of maybe GPT-3 or any other models that we are using, I guess. So yeah,
Yeah, I
I
mean, once again, what you're showing is it's a complicated situation, right? You know, these are not situations that are easily dealt with. It's hard, certainly for people outside the field to think about, and for people inside too. It's so complicated, and there's a lot of stakeholders here, and but I think we need to think about this from all angles, right? Some people do try to make the case it's one way, right? And and it's not necessarily one way. It's a really complex situation in its own way, right? The weapons question is also complex in a completely different way. And we could talk about other things, right? We could talk about deep fakes and the problem of misinformation, right? Which is that is a huge concern, and GPT-3 is rolled up into that, as well as systems that can judges and video. And I worry about us moving towards a place where it's hard to believe anything you see or read, because the machines are getting increasingly good at generating fake stuff, so to speak, on their own, right? I think we're still at the point where the systems aren't quite good enough at it to be really concerned yet. GPT-3 can, if you roll the dice 10 times, it'll produce 5 blog posts that are perfect, but 5 that are not, right? Once it gets to 10 out of 10, then we've got a problem, right? Once we get a system that can just generate any text, in a second and then distribute it, then we're in trouble.
Yeah.
And society really has to rethink the way it looks at anything. I mean, we're already in this situation where it's hard to know what's real and what's not online, and we're losing our grasp on the truth. If you introduce a world where the machines can just generate the fake news and the fake images second by second, then we're in an even different place.
Yeah, and I guess the problem with this whole discussion would be, this is kind of a genie that like you have got out, but there is no way back to put in. So I mean, there's no way. So I guess the regulations would be the only way you can actually check forward on these topics. But because we were talking on these terms like AI ethics and big tech companies trying to make these products go forward, and one of the biggest discussions on Twitter that comes to my mind is Dr. Gebru's and Dr. Mitchell's resignation from the company. But few of the things that I have learned, I mean, of course I have read the paper. From my understanding is, but for people who are listening to this podcast and who might not know, what do you think this showcases a potential to the AI ethics community? Is this kind of a major big concern that people should know about? Because it's hard to conclude whose fault it was and what's the end goal, or like what is the end product of that particular happening. So from your, and I saw you wrote an article, so definitely you would have kind of learned a bit about on this topic. Is, can you talk to like what are the concerns that people should know about of this particular event happening, and what could be a future state that could go forward onto this point?
Well, I think the situation highlights this particular thing that we've just talked about, right? This notion that these large language models like GPT-3 and BERT are the future of these companies, and there's real incentive to get them out. At the same time, what Timnit Gebru and Meg Mitchell and others in that paper are showing is that they can show bias against women and people of color, and they can generate toxic language, right? And so, in pointing that out in a paper with their names on it, including their Google affiliations at the time, right? That is, in one way or another, that's a threat to what Google wants to do with those language models, right? And so it's a very real example of the clash that I was talking about, where the aims of the company are going to clash with people who are saying, hold on a second, before we release this stuff, we have to think about this. And that's exactly what's going on there. And again, that example is Google in particular, but this clash is not limited to Google. It's something that is going to have to play out at other companies too, like Microsoft is the other prime example, but any others that can benefit from this technology, right? They're going to have to work through that one way or another, because there are not just people who are concerned about this in the community. What you saw with the Microsoft Taybot is that that affects anyone, right? You release a product to the world, that affects the world, and so there are a lot of issues to work through here, and I think that the situation with Timnit and Meg at Google that you brought up, really shows what's going on there.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I guess again, this comes to the same point as regulations. I guess the regulations need to be improved because there is no way back from this point. I mean, these technologies are being developed, and a lot of people are working in different capacities. So I guess those regulation terms might need to be updated. But yeah, trying to like maybe take a step back and maybe just getting your view on few of the things that I personally find very fascinating to always learn is what, according to you, you think are the gaps in using AI versus like what the AI tools that we have from industries that are highly mature and maybe good to use versus what the real world scenarios want. So do you see any gaps, and what are these gaps that you frequently are really motivated to learn more about, is what AI can do versus what people actually want, and how to bridge this gap?
There's so many gaps, right? I mean, as much as we've seen improvement over the past 10 years, you know, we're hardly to the point where technology can do anything. And one of the things that's been particularly interesting to me over the past, just 3 or 4, certainly since I got to the Times, is the self-driving car area, right? That's something where these companies, um, insisted that this was going to happen, um, by 2019, by 2020. The tech press and the mainstream press just sort of heard this and then just repeated it. And, most of the world was convinced we were going to have self-driving cars, driving here, there, and everywhere by now. And the reality is that the technology is nowhere near up to that, right? For many reasons. The technology is powerful, don't get me wrong, um, but it's going to be a while before we see these in large numbers on the streets carrying people um, uh, everywhere they need to go, right? And this is where the technology is most powerful, right? The pattern recognition, the neural network technology we've been talking about. One of the great applications for that is robotics, self-driving cars, the kind of autonomous drones that I wrote about today with Anduril, um, robots in the warehouse, right? There's been huge progress there because of improvements in image recognition, computer vision. Um, but at the same time, um, when you're trying to use that in a chaotic world, and our world is chaotic, right? By definition, it's just filled with uncertainty. And so, you know, once you take it to the real world, you're just faced with so many problems you didn't anticipate. And these ideas are certainly this neural network idea, and if you apply it also with reinforcement learning, as some have done in the warehouse, you can see huge gains. And we're starting to see companies deal with stuff in the warehouse that they haven't been able to deal with before. But that's a relatively contained space. It's different than getting out on the open road or the closed urban road as it might be, and trying to get these cars to do everything they need to do, in the middle of San Francisco or wherever else. That is a hard thing to do, and I think we're still a ways away from that really happening, despite all the hype over the past several years.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that was actually my next question that I wanted to ask was we surely discussed about a lot of this reporting that goes on, necessarily not just New York Times, but a lot of places that might not be that much I would say trustworthy, but they definitely hype that okay, we are moving towards singularity or technological singularity. And what we discuss also, the rationalists who think that AI is going to be a problem for all of us someday. But yeah, definitely it feels good to know, because most of the people who are into the pure research, they do understand we are not even close to what we call consciousness. We don't understand how to change our reactions. So yeah, definitely I do agree to that. And one of the few things I was curious is I knew you covered a certain amount of time learning more about bitcoins, and it has been something very very highly debated on right now on Twitter and other platforms. I personally don't know a lot about bitcoins apart from what blockchain means, because that's what a student's mind really goes while I'm looking at these things. But I want to learn more if you have any insights. I'm not sure if you are actively following those lines, but I want to learn because what from what I understand is it promotes the financial freedom, right? Like it promotes that we might not be bounded to any kind of regulations of what the economy and financial structures have been over there. But again, it brings with its own challenges of regulations. How do we control people doing illegal stuff, and how do we maintain other regulations? Even I don't even have the words of what that means, but trying to maintain and control those things. I'm wondering if you have any take on, would Bitcoin traverse towards something that is much more serious, that is part of your daily transactions or part of your daily life, or is it just something that people will play and it will just go off after a certain while? What do you think?
Well, I mean, that is the main question, I will say. And the other thing I'll say is that I did cover it a lot when I was with Wired, and since I moved to the Times, I haven't really covered it because we got a great guy who's covering it, almost full time, and that's Nathaniel Popper at the Times, and he's really our Bitcoin guy. But I think you asked the right question, because what we've really seen over the past several years is Bitcoin, as a means of investment, right? People buy Bitcoin, the price goes up, they sell, they make a bunch of money, or maybe it goes down and they lose it. And this has gone on for years, this cycle, and there are so many interesting ideas to talk about when it comes to this technology. It's a fascinating technology, but what we're still waiting for is this really becoming, a currency, right? Where you're paying for stuff and you're buying stuff and you're selling stuff, and that's and we're certainly still waiting for that. It's unclear how or when that might happen. And then this idea that the blockchain can be a way not only of managing money but so many other assets. We're still waiting for that too, right? IBM talked about this as sort of the future of supply chains and all this. They built a big group around it, but now they've shrunk that group and laid off a bunch of people, and that idea seems even further off, right? There's a lot of interesting stuff you can do with a blockchain, but how much of it has really been done? We're seeing, just this week, a colleague of mine, Aaron Griffith, wrote about these sort of these digital assets, right, on the blockchain, like a GIF or the like, an image of a Pop Tart cat is selling for thousands of dollars only because people know that they have the only one, because a blockchain shows that they have the only one. How useful is that ultimately? I don't know, but people are paying real money for it. So that, it's not as if this is just hypothetical. It's actually happening. But when it comes to really driving our economy as a currency, we're still waiting for that.
Yeah. So I guess, I mean, to rephrase the question, would it be like, at least the idea has the potential, right? Like you said, we don't see the maturity in terms of how it can scale, which is something, like, I mean, technology is good at, right? Like if you have an idea of research, you can scale it to thousands of users. But if the idea itself has its own self-sustaining base, and I honestly think, I mean, we have a lot of people on Twitter who are pro supporters of these particular technologies. So in my honest opinion, it has a good, like, it would definitely take time, but I mean, definitely the idea is much more self-sustaining. It has a merit in itself, but it will take time for people to develop things that is much more robust and usable for layman users. But I want to give the stage to you for a while, because I have learned that your book is coming up, and I'll let you give you the details of how people can find that book. But from what I learned is your book is coming on March 16th, and definitely I have been reading, I have been following you on Twitter for a while, so it definitely has to do with how AI has been designed and maybe developed by these big tech companies over the years. So I'll let you speak to more about like what the book is really about and what can readers expect.
When I tell people that it's really about people, it's about a group of people who believed in this idea of a neural network for decades, often in the face of enormous skepticism, right? This is an old idea that at various stages along the way, most of the world, including the AI community, did not think would work. And regardless, there are some people, most notably a guy named Jeff Hinton, who I mentioned, who was at the University of Toronto and is now at Google. He embraced this idea in the early 70s when it was at its nadir, meaning almost no one believed it would work. And he embraced it, and since then has continued to work on it, even as the idea, sort of, blossomed in the 80s, thanks largely to his work, but then, again fell out of favor in the 90s. He continued to work on it. And in a lot of ways, and this isn't widely known, and a lot of it hasn't come out yet prior to my book, he, in very direct and specific and personal ways, pushed this technology into some of these companies, right? He had a real hand in that. And I'm fascinated by personalities like that who really believe in what they're doing, even though most of the world thinks they're crazy, right? And Jeff is an extreme example of that, but there are other equally fascinating people in this book. And what I kept telling myself as I wrote the book, and I keep telling people, is that if I can show who Jeff Hinton is in this book, it will work. He's a remarkable person in so many different ways. In the first sentence of the book, and this isn't necessarily widely known, you learn that he literally does not sit down. He has a back problem, and it dates back to when he was a teenager in London, and he lifted a space heater for his mother, and he slipped a disc in his back. And by the time he was in his late 50s, the disc would slip over and over again, and it would really incapacitate him. He had trouble doing his research. His students talk about, like, walking into his office, and inevitably he's laying on the desk, and they're like doing their reviews with him laying on the desk or on a cot. And it really became a problem. And so he decided the only way to deal with it was to literally stop sitting down. And what that means is he can't drive. When he gets in a car, he's got to lay down in the back seat. He can't fly, because if you fly on a commercial airline, you have to sit during takeoff and landing. And that's caught up in this story, of the past 10 years, where he is working to push this idea into Microsoft and Google and other companies, and he's got to travel across the world, and he's got to find a way to do it with his back problem. And the lengths that he would go to are astounding. Taking trains across the country, but there's this other incredible story about how he gets to London to vet DeepMind when Google's going to buy DeepMind. I mean, they're just almost unbelievable stories, and I feel like whether you care about AI or not, whether you study AI or not, this is a book worth reading just for people like him. He's just flat out funny too. The guy has an amazing sense of humor, which I hope comes through in the book. He's one of those people who makes you laugh and who makes your jaw drop. He's always one step ahead of you. He's everybody should meet him, and hopefully, in at least a small way, they can meet him through my book.
Yeah, definitely. That sounds enough exciting already, because it's always good to know of how these people are apart from the research papers, because you definitely don't understand how they came up with the idea, which is something very unique in its way. And to know them personally on a bit different note than technical is something people will definitely appreciate. So yeah, and how can the people actually get that book? Like, is it would it be available on Amazon, or is it something, can you plug in that too?
Oh, absolutely! It's available for pre-order on Amazon, and Barnes and Noble, Target, Walmart, independent bookstores. There's a hardcover version that's coming out March 16th, but also Kindle version, digital version. There's an audio version, which I haven't heard yet. I'm excited to see and excited to hear. So you can pre-order that now, and I'll be doing a couple of excerpts. There's a great story that revolves around Hinton and sort of ground zero for this revolution over the past 10 years. The book begins that way, and that excerpt will be available on March 16th, so people can get a real taste of what this book is about. I've been working on this for years, so I'm just dying for it to get out, so people can read and hear these stories, and they're not individual stories. Like, this is a real narrative, right, about these people and how they interacted over the years and how they moved into these companies and how these companies responded. And as interesting as Jeff is, there are so many other interesting people in the book, from Demis Hassabis, who's the founder and CEO of DeepMind, a fascinating character in his own right, Timnit Gebru and Meg Mitchell are characters in the book. So when the bias issue comes up, they appear as amazing characters. I shouldn't even call them characters. These are all real people, of course, right? Just amazing people. But I go on down the line. Ian Goodfellow, talk about a funny character. The GAN father, as they call him. The guy who invented the GAN and these generative models, which have become so important. The story of the night he invented the GAN is like astounding and astoundingly funny. The guy's got a great sense of humor. He's now at Apple. He's a character. But also, this isn't just an American story. China is a big player in the story. And, there are a couple of Chinese-born researchers that are major characters working for major companies. And some great parts of the narrative that haven't ever been discussed before that I hope will really capture people. We'll see. I'm anxious, as you can tell.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, to me, definitely it buys me, at least, because I'll be definitely interested to learn on a side note of what these people are, because definitely we read papers and it definitely begs the question, like, how did you come up with GAN? Like, it's much more intuitive if you learn what GANs actually look like. You are really fascinated, like, who thought of this particular idea? Like, it seems very intuitive, but the intuition takes like years of time. So definitely getting to understand the psyche in a much more different manner is going to be great. Yeah, definitely you got at least one reader from me, so
Right on.
definitely.
Good to
and
hear.
and just one last question before we end is like related to this book, is you mentioned about these big tech companies. What, according to you, are the big tech companies that are actually trying to move forward the domain of AI? Because I see a lot of companies who are definitely developing these products, but they are much more confined to their product development or the revenue products. But according to you and your history of learning about these tools and what are the motivations behind them, which, according to you, companies are actually trying to make these fields forward rather than just focusing on revenues?
Well, the two big examples are DeepMind and OpenAI, right? They're, in a lot of ways, research labs, um, building stuff that's not necessarily for product. Although I will say OpenAI is moving more towards the product direction. But one of the most important results, if not the most important result of the past 10 years, is the protein folding result from DeepMind from this past fall. Where they essentially cracked a biological sciences problem that that people have worked on for decades and didn't think would be cracked for decades to come, right? And it's a problem that can really help with drug discovery. It can really help with the type of situation we're in now, where we're dealing with a pandemic. The next time this happens, this result can help repurpose existing drugs, right? Figuring out what drugs we already have that can be applied to a virus or a disease, but also developing vaccines and developing new drugs. That's a real important result, and it's an example of the type of stuff that DeepMind is working on. There's a lot of argument about how long they'll be able to continue to do this kind of blue sky research, but that's what they're doing now, and I think that's a prime example. So those are the two big labs that are doing that. But there's also interesting work going on all over the place, right? Not only the U.S., we mentioned China, other parts of the world. Europe is a big center for this stuff, as well as Canada, of course, and that's a big part of my book. Certainly, some companies are very much focused on product, right? Amazon's like that, Microsoft, but then at some of the other companies, you do see more of this blue sky stuff.
Right. Yeah, definitely, I agree to that. And yeah, just one last ending note question would be, I know this question might be ironic, is what are the best books that you would recommend people who want to learn about AI? I mean, definitely, I would definitely recommend your book, definitely, but these books can be, you have been referring to them maybe in the past few years or something, that have really stood out for you to refer back what AI means, what people have said. What books would you recommend for anyone who is a newbie?
Well, I mean, I like John Markoff's Machines of Loving Grace. That came out a bit before the revolution of the past few years, so to speak. So it kind of covers things from a different angle. But he's great. Like, John was my predecessor at the Times, and he really understands this stuff. But part of what I want to do with my own book, I mean, just frankly, is step back from what has already been written and try to explain this in terms that anyone can understand. And I think that's often missing from the books about AI, right? They're about like how it's going to improve the world, or it's about how it's going to destroy the world, or it's about this this little niche, right? Maybe it's about the mathematics of neural nets. And what I really want to do is give the field of book I feel like it deserves, right? The real story of what's going on here and has gone on, and show people how they can think about it. There are a lot of great textbooks on this and the like, but where's like the real mainstream book that can really convey this to everyone, whether they're an AI researcher or my mother. I think that's what needs to be done. I'm hoping my book can do it, right? But it needs to be done, right? This is such a fascinating field. It's such an important field. Like I said, the people in it are so interesting. It deserves more, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I definitely see this book at least being read and maybe cited by people who are really into AI, who want to learn. So definitely, kudos to that, and good luck. Definitely, it's going to
Thank
go
you.
places. So yeah. But for the podcast, thanks. That's all I had. I mean, those were the questions that I had that I think were the biggest pinpoints in my head in the last few months. So thanks for answering them patiently, and thanks for being here. And yeah, I'll leave a link to all your social media handles in the video description so that people can check out your latest updates on the book, or in general whatever you write about. That's more than amazing. So um, thanks for being here.
Fantastic.
And it was nice talking to you.
I really appreciate you having me on. It was a lot of fun.